right into the program because we have a lot to cover. So let me just say that in light of Benjamin Netanyahu's recent re-election and his pronouncement that there will be no Palestinian state during the time he's a prime minister, many in Washington are re-examining U.S. policy toward Israel and Palestine. For the first time in many years, a U.S. administration is looking at Washington's relationship with Israel with more critical eyes. Some see changes ahead, and others are more cynical and see this as a passing phase. So our panel discussion today will consider the current situation from different perspectives and assess the short-term and long-term implications of Washington's evolving policy in the region. We're very fortunate to have three experts with us today, one of whom is on her way, but she should be here any moment. Each of them has vast experience in affairs that deal with Palestine, Israel, and U.S. policy in the region. They often write political analyses and speak in various media outlets. I'll ask each one of them to speak for about 12 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. Those of you who are online can tweet us your questions at Palestine Center. So let me introduce our distinguished guests. William Quandt, who's here on my right, is Professor Emeritus of Politics at the University of Virginia. Previously, he was a senior fellow in the Policy Studies program at the Brookings Institution. In the 70s, he served as a staff member at the National Security Council and was actively involved in the negotiations that led to the Camp David Accords and the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. He has many books, and I'll just mention two of them: Peace Process, American Diplomacy and the Arab-Israeli Conflict since 1967, and Between Ballots and Bullets, Algeria's Transition from Authoritarianism. Our speaker to Bill Quandt's right is Josh Ruebner. He's the policy director of the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation, which is a national coalition that advocates ending the occupation and supporting justice and human rights. He's a former analyst in Middle East affairs at the Congressional Research Service, and he's the author of Shattered Hopes: Obama's Failure to Broker Israeli-Palestinian Peace. This is a book that's now actually in paperback. It was updated through 2014, and it's in a second edition. In fact, we have it in the boardroom for sale. And our third speaker, who will be here shortly, is Laila El-Haddad. She's an award-winning writer and social media activist from Gaza City. She served as the Gaza correspondent for Al Jazeera English, as a regular contributor to the BBC and The Guardian online, and a correspondent for Pacifica's Free Speech Radio News. Laila is the author of Gaza Mom, Palestine, Politics, Parenting, and Everything in Between, and she's the co-author of The Gaza Kitchen, A Palestinian Culinary Journey. Please join me in welcoming our speakers. And so, Bill, if you'd like to go first.
Thank you, Zaina, and thanks to all of you for coming today. I wish I had an upbeat message. I've been talking about this topic for so long, I have the feeling I'm kind of prophet of gloom every time I stand up to talk about the obstacles in the way of seeing this conflict brought to a decent end. And although there are some intriguing tones in the current atmosphere after Prime Minister Netanyahu's very offensive comments at the time of his election and subsequently, I don't think it's justified to conclude that this is going to change attitudes in Washington to the point where we should expect dramatically new policies. So what I want to do is try to talk a little bit about the broad regional context in which I see President Obama and his foreign policy team trying to shape whatever they can of their legacy with respect to the challenges facing them in the Middle East, which are quite considerable. And I want to do this by taking a very short look back. Maybe this will encourage you to buy Josh's book so you can get more of what went wrong and why the hopes were shattered in the 6 years plus to date. and then talk about where we stand today. I think it's instructive to look at how quickly Obama, as president in early 2009, did set out a Middle East agenda, fairly ambitious one for himself, for the country. And of course, it was meant to differentiate what he was going to do from what his predecessor had done. Not unusual. Presidents come in and they have campaigned on doing things differently, and certainly Obama had opposed the war in Iraq, rather courageously so, and consistently so. But it wasn't the only item on his Middle East agenda. He talked from the beginning about changing the basic relationship between the United States and the Muslim world based on a posture of mutual interest and mutual respect. Interesting language, and very much designed to differentiate him from his predecessor. He talked about getting American troops out of Iraq and out of Afghanistan in a responsible way, but clearly on a time schedule that would be reasonably accelerated. And he talked about diplomacy with one's adversaries, including with Syria and with Iran. And he didn't say it, but presumably nobody was off limits from the policy of more diplomacy, less use of force. And then he talked about the importance of peace between Israelis and Palestinians. So a pretty ambitious agenda. Without going into details of what went wrong, it's pretty clear that not very much of it worked out the way he had expected. Some bits of it have, and I want to try to be fair-minded about this, but I think very quickly the reasons that it didn't work out is, first of all, perhaps it wasn't very well designed or very well strategized from the outset, but also things happened that just could not have been anticipated. One of the things that happened right away is that Netanyahu became prime minister in Israel, and I think that very quickly would have forced any American president to wonder how realistic it was to think that with this prime minister he was going to be able to get very far on his commitment to Israeli-Palestinian peace. You have to remember, when he first made that statement, it looked as if it might not have been Netanyahu. The outgoing Olmert regime had made at least some kind of an offer to the Palestinians that was at least closer to the notion of a two-state solution than had been seen previously. But with Netanyahu, he was, of course, completely against anything like that. Then I think there were the other things that happened in the Middle East that distracted the Obama administration from what its initial agenda might have been, the Arab Spring uprisings, which had not been foreseen. Perhaps they should have been, but they hadn't been, and required a fairly complicated set of reactions, which were not very well designed, and ended up taking a lot of attention away from other items on the agenda. And then recently the emergence of Daesh or ISIS in Iraq and Syria, of course, has forced some rethinking of American policy in that region as well. So where does that leave us now? And let me just quickly go through where I think we now stand with his larger Middle East policies. I think it's still true that this president is very unlikely to respond to the pressures to re-engage militarily in the Middle East on a large scale. You know, there are people, John McCain, who would just send troops back in. More boots on the ground seem to be the people as if they haven't learned anything. And I think that Obama really will resist that, although not entirely. You can see already in Iraq there's a little bit of mission creep back. But I don't think we're going to see any large-scale commitment of ground troops. Secondly, I think that after two attempts, one where Obama himself was relatively involved and the other where his Secretary of State, John Kerry, was involved, two attempts at Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, I don't expect that in the remainder of his presidency he's going to make another major effort. We'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. I do think that he has made progress on another of his agenda items, which was relations with Iran. And I think he deserves credit. He and his Secretary of State deserve credit for getting a much better framework agreement than I expected. And I think he's going to get it through. It's not a foregone conclusion. There are weeks of difficult negotiations ahead. But I think when we get some distance on this presidency, the one thing that may stand out as an achievement, from my standpoint, is a fundamental breakthrough in the relationship with Iran. And it's not just about the nuclear file, although that's important, but it is about bringing, I think, to maybe not an end, but at least beginning the process of ending the really poisonous relationship that has existed between the United States and Iran. Now, I know there are people in the Middle East who don't like this. They actually kind of thrive on the polarization between the United States and Iran. But I think it's been bad for the region. I think that any move in the direction of better U.S.-Iran relations will have the effect of easing over time the kind of poisonous sectarianism that has worked its way into Middle East politics. So that may be the one achievement that he has. It is, however, a kind of odd legacy in its impact on other issues, because he's going to have a fairly serious fight with the Israelis over this. I think he's going to win it, which shows that you can occasionally stand up to the lobby and its supporters and win. But I think it's going to take so much time and so much political capital that there's not going to be much left for him to devote to Israeli-Palestinian issues, even if he were to want to. So what might he do on Israel-Palestine, which is the topic that most of you probably care most about? I don't think an awful lot. I think he meant it when he said that he thought that Netanyahu was not going to be a partner for the kind of political settlement that the United States has advocated, which in many cases, and many people don't think is realistic any longer in any case, the two-state approach. So what else might happen if not the classical two-state paradigm being negotiated? I think there is a body of opinion in Washington. It almost got its voice last fall that after the collapse of the Israeli-Palestinian effort that Kerry had made, there was some thought that the United States should just put out its thoughts on how this ought to be resolved. You know, we heard everybody's points of view, and maybe a clear statement of a kind of Kerry or Obama parameters to, in some sense, supplement or take the place of the old Clinton parameters would be of some value. It would kind of put in front of publics in the Middle East and in this country what this administration thinks would be a sensible, reasonable outcome. The problem is that as they started drafting it, some people thought it's so general and bland that it's not going to impress anybody, or if you start filling in the blanks and getting very detailed, you're going to get into this typical problem of everybody arguing over the little details and not keeping any focus on the larger picture. So they shelved the proposal last fall, as I understand it. Josh may know more about this than I do, but it's still there in the background. As you know, if we can't get the parties to negotiate, maybe there is still some value in trying to put forward a reasonable outline and get as much international support from Europeans, from UN Security Council, from Arab League, anybody to leave a kind of marker there for the future. Whether this would do any good can leave to discussion, but it is one of the thoughts that some people are having. Another idea that we've seen hints of, including some public hints recently, is that the United States will no longer block things in the United Nations if initiatives are taken to, for example, have a resolution saying that settlement activity should be considered illegal under international law, which most people already think it is, but the United States has typically tried to block those types of initiatives. Maybe we won't do that anymore. Maybe we'll just abstain, or if a statehood resolution comes up in the United Nations. Instead of vetoing it, we might again either abstain or, you know, heaven forfend, perhaps even vote in favor of it. I wouldn't get my hopes up too high, but I do think there is a slightly different tone about we're not bound automatically to use our veto power every time the Israelis get nervous about what's happening in the UN. They sort of lost their right to make that claim on us when they opted out of the peace process. The problem with the period we're entering into is that Obama obviously is running out of time. It may be true that he can count on another, 18 months or so before he has to really shut down. But politically, he's got the remainder of this year in which I think he can say to himself, I have to get the Iran deal done and implemented. If that doesn't work, it's a real mess. He has to do the most he can with the least risk in containing and pushing back the ISIS threat, which means, you know, more use of air power and drones and things like that, not boots on the ground. And then deal with the unforeseen crises that periodically pop up. I sense that they're trying to manage a lot of things right now without any overarching strategy. They want the deal with Iran, but they feel they have to appease the Saudis on Yemen, even though I think their judgment is that what's happening in Yemen is with the Saudi bombings doesn't make an awful lot of sense. So an awful lot of things are going on. And the domestic politics of this is crazy. It's as if Congress is simply, or at least a large part of Congress simply wants the president to fail, no matter what the issue is. So he can't count on much bipartisanship there. And that affects the mood in the country to some extent. You hear on all the talk shows people saying really terrible things about the Iran deal is going to pave the way for Iran to have a nuclear weapon, as if people haven't paid any attention to the actual content of this. American public opinion, I think, is more sensible than Congress. I think they will go along quite supportively with the Iran deal, but I don't think on very many other issues there's much support for tackling difficult and ambitious projects such as finding a new approach to Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking. So I'm afraid that for the issue that is high on our agenda, I think for most people here, finding some decent way of bringing Israelis and Palestinians to peaceful coexistence in historic Palestine, I don't see a good alternative in sight for the near future. I think it is probably the case that the two-state paradigm, which I have supported for a long time, is pretty much at the end of its useful life. It's just not going to be revived anytime soon. I say that with some regret because I think there was a certain amount of legitimacy accorded to it over a period of time. But I think we have to be realistic and say that that's pretty much gone. The problem is that I don't see the alternative. I know there are enthusiasts who are saying, well, what about the one-state solution? I think there are outcomes that could be described as a one-state outcome, but I don't think they're solutions in the sense they will not be achieved anytime in the near future through negotiations between the parties. I just don't see that as realistic. Some of you may, and we might want to discuss that in the discussion. So I'm afraid that the near-term prospect is more of the same. That is continued occupation, continued siege of Gaza, periodic outbreaks of violence. Not a very happy prospect, to say the least. With hindsight, looking back on the various moments in American diplomacy on this issue, I think we had one opening, and I guess I would say that when you have these openings, you should not squander them. And it really began with the Madrid conference, first Bush administration, the very able stewardship of James Baker, and it lasted through the 1990s. And I think by the end of the 1990s, the opening that began with Madrid and the negotiating framework that existed at that time pretty much came to an end. We've seen efforts made subsequent to that, but the period when this conflict was, I think, ripe for being resolved through diplomatic efforts was basically the 1990s. And since then, it's been harder and harder, almost year by year, to imagine a peaceful negotiated settlement. So with those not very encouraging comments, thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to take questions later.
The Palestine Center for inviting me to this panel. It's an honor to be with such distinguished colleagues for this event. I'd like to start my remarks with remembrance of how exactly the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu won re-election last month. As you remember, he was neck and neck in the polls with the center-left Zionist Union. And as he was in danger of being defeated, he made a very clear play to, I would say, not to his right, but to expose what have always been the reality of his positions, which included justification for Israel's illegal colonization of Palestinian land, included blatant and gross appeals to racism against Palestinian citizens of Israel. He said that his government was, quote unquote, in danger because Palestinians were actually exercising their democratic right to vote in droves, Netanyahu said. And of course, most famously, Netanyahu also won this election by repudiating the notion that there would be a Palestinian state in even its most truncated form under his watch. This drew significant opposition from the Obama administration, which said that the United States will reassess its relations with Israel because of the State of Israel's repudiation of Palestinian statehood. Now, we haven't seen much in terms of actual policy initiatives or policy changes as a result of the so-called reassessment just yet. I would expect that we're not going to see anything until the Iran nuclear negotiations are concluded. So what can the Obama administration do in the very short time frame that's left to reassess these policies, to change these policies in a more positive and fruitful direction? In the hopes that there are some people here today from the State Department or maybe watching online, I'm going to first offer up some very small-scale, very pragmatic steps that the Obama administration can actually do to reassess these relations, and I wrote about this in The Hill a few weeks ago, and then I'll conclude by saying that these small-scale steps that I'm proposing are nowhere near enough in terms of where we are today. So, for the benefit of official Washington, here are my policy recommendations for the Obama administration and its reassessment. Number one, yes, U.S. military aid to Israel should, of course, be ended because of the grave human rights violations that we are implicated in through these weapons, but we know that that's not a political reality for the Obama administration. As I discuss in my book, Shattered Hopes, for 6 years, we've seen sanctions not even on the table as an option, no matter how egregious Israel's policies are toward the Palestinians, and I wouldn't expect that sanctions in a real way would be on the table in Obama's remaining 2 years. But he could nevertheless clog the arms pipeline without publicly announcing that he's slowing down the delivery of weapons to Israel. This would be very significant and be a very sharp indication to the State of Israel that it wasn't business as usual. Two, the Obama administration could send a report to Congress documenting Israel's copious violations of the Arms Export Control Act and getting some sanctions placed on the delivery of particular weapon systems. This is something that the Reagan administration did twice back in the 1980s. They froze for 6 years the delivery of cluster bombs to Israel, and they froze the delivery of F-16s to Israel as well as punishment for Israel misusing these weapons. This is something that Obama could do. We heard rumors of him doing it with Hellfire missiles during Israel's horrific attack on Gaza last summer. And related, the Obama administration could place sanctions under Israel under what's known as the Leahy Law. This specifically targets individual units of military, forbidding them from receiving U.S. training or equipment for their participation in human rights abuses. And it also prevents individual soldiers who have engaged in gross human rights violations from receiving visas to come to the United States for any reason. These two options of reporting on Israel's violations of the Arms Export Control Act, reporting on Israel's violations of the Leahy Law, are even more imperative today because of the recent report that was issued by Defense for Children International Palestine. And I know that Brad Parker was here last week. I hope he discussed this new report that DCI Palestine released, which shows that during Operation Protective Edge, Israel's attack on the besieged Gaza Strip last summer, Israel literally and deliberately targeted for killing hundreds of Palestinian children, deliberately targeting for death Palestinian children, which I'm sure Laila will talk about more later. This necessitates these laws being invoked when it comes to our policies toward Israel. Now, when it comes to Israel's ongoing colonization of Palestinian land, there are also measures that the Obama administration can take that don't involve congressional permission, which would, of course, never happen. One would be to declare Israeli settlements a national emergency under what's known as the National Emergencies Act. This act gives broad powers to the executive branch to implement financial sanctions and to permit dealings in foreign currencies to sustain a situation leading to an emergency. So the president could declare Israeli settlements to be an emergency and make sure that any U.S. dollar flows that would directly or indirectly support Israel's settlements would be made illegal. And this would be a major, major step, and this relates to my fifth recommendation to the Obama administration for how they should reassess this policy, because in the United States we have a gross situation where there are dozens of so-called charitable organizations in the United States literally funneling tens of millions of dollars every single year to support Israel's settlements. The IRS could easily shut down these charities and do so under the guideline of the IRS that requires these 501c3s not to engage in discrimination. And Israeli settlements are obviously clearly discriminatory because Palestinians can't live in there, etc. So these are my very mild suggestions to the Obama administration. But we are at a historical turning point, and clearly tinkering around the edges of what has been a failed policy for so many decades is clearly not enough. What we need, instead of tinkering and pretending that the status quo can continue, is really a fundamental and whole-scale reevaluation of the premises of U.S. policy toward Israel and the Palestinian people. And I say this because really for the first time ever, we have an admission and a total congruence between the United States and Israel that a quote-unquote two-state resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian issue is not achievable. Now, we've heard and we know Netanyahu's remarks to that effect very well. But actually, U.S. officials have said the same thing as well. Secretary of State John Kerry testified to Congress that there exists a 1 to 2 year window of opportunity for there being a Palestinian state. That even he recognizes that because of Israel's ongoing colonization of Palestinian land, the idea of establishing a contiguous and sovereign entity will not be possible. But John Kerry didn't make this prediction of a 1 to 2 year window after Netanyahu's election. In fact, he made this prediction to Congress in April of 2013, exactly 2 years ago. So even according to John Kerry's own admission, the window for a two-state resolution has been shut. And in fact, after the collapse of the recent round of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations last April, April 2014, the lead negotiator, a fellow by the name of Martin Indyk, who was certainly no friend of the Palestinian people, by the way. Martin Indyk used to work for the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, the leading pro-Israel organization, and he founded its sister think tank, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Martin Indyk is a dyed-in-the-wool Zionist, self-admittedly. What Martin Indyk said, actually to the Washington Institute on Near East Policy, after these negotiations collapsed in April of last year, is that Israel's policies of colonizing Palestinian land is creating, quote, an irreversible binational reality. So there you have it. Senior U.S. foreign policy officials admitting that the paradigm for resolving this issue that has been the official U.S. policy since at least President Clinton's administration formally has now closed. And, in fact, virtually every proposal to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian issue since 1947, since the original partition of Palestine, has been premised on the notion of partitioning the land into two states. We are now, in many respects, in a situation where we were before 1948, before the Nakba, before the establishment of the State of Israel, where partition of Palestine is widely recognized by both the United States and Israel as not a realistic resolution anymore. And what's especially interesting to me is that U.S. policymakers from the get-go, before Truman's recognition of the State of Israel in 1948, recognized all of the fundamental problematics of dividing the land that we've witnessed over the past 7 decades. So I want to draw your attention before I close to 2 memos that were received by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt back in 1943. He commissioned different delegations to go out to the Near East and to report on what to do about the question of Palestine. And one fellow he sent was a guy by the name of Brigadier General Patrick Hurley. This is what Hurley reported back to FDR in 1943. The Zionist organization in Palestine has indicated its commitment to an enlarged program for 1, a sovereign Jewish state, which would embrace Palestine and probably Transjordan, and 2, an eventual transfer of the Arab population from Palestine to Iraq. Hurley furthermore said that among the Arabs there is little or no anti-Jewish sentiment as we ordinarily use the term, nor is there serious opposition to the concept of a Jewish national home as opposed to a sovereign state. Notwithstanding these factors, there is deep-seated Arab hostility to any immigration program intended to create a Jewish majority in Palestine and to establish a Jewish sovereign state. This was one set of advice that Roosevelt received. The other came from Lieutenant Colonel Harold Hoskins, who in 1943 wrote to FDR that it is important for the American people to realize that Arab feelings remain uncompromisingly against the acceptance of a political Zionist state in Palestine. It should be very clear to the American people, therefore, that only by military force can a Zionist state in Palestine be imposed on the Arabs. So instead of partitioning the land and establishing a Jewish sovereign state in it, what Hoskins recommended was that the existing population of 1 million Arabs, this is back in 1943, 1 million Arabs and 500,000 Jews in Palestine is not to be moved, and that this population is to form a binational state within a proposed Levant federation. So why do I conclude my remarks here today talking about what are the Obama administration's policy options moving forward in this reassessment by citing these long forgotten memos that are gathering a lot of dust in the libraries of the State Department? The reason I do so is because I think they articulate quite well the realization by the United States that the idea of Zionism, the idea of establishing a Jewish sovereign state in Palestine, necessarily involved the dispossession of the indigenous inhabitants of the land, involved the implacable opposition of the indigenous inhabitants of the land, because who in their right mind would agree to be colonized and dispossessed out of their home, and that the Zionist project to establish a Jewish state in Palestine necessitated ongoing military force to maintain. These are the clear and logical conclusions that can be drawn from these memos in 1943. And in many respects, what President Obama finds himself in a position of today in 2015 is the exact same position that FDR found himself in 1943. Except here, instead of the idea of establishing a Jewish state, now since 1967, we have a Jewish state establishing its hegemony over all of historic Palestine. And this situation whereby one people dominates the other through this apartheid system of government in which Palestinians are treated to lesser or no rights is clearly untenable. So what we need is not just a tinkering around the edges of what's possible, but a fundamental and whole-scale reevaluation and creative thinking about how to move forward. Thank you.
I'm here, I guess, to give everyone a reality check and some perspective about, what's going on the ground, especially in Gaza. And I want to start, what's missing in all this. I want to start just by reading a few brief sentence-long poems by a young Palestinian student in Gaza. And the first one is simply, "For sale, Gazan passport, never used." The second one is, "They killed her. Something changed. Numbers." And the third one is, "Let's study. The power went out." The fourth one is, "She decides to rot in bed." I think that was actually all. And the reason I just started is because I try not to be a cynic, but it's very difficult when you look at what's happening on the ground now, and especially as it relates to young people. Because the reality is Palestinians are in survival mode right now. And speaking to a lot of friends and family in Gaza on a daily basis who, like millions of others, are stuck there for going on 100 days, was the recent report yesterday. I think the Rafah crossing, which is the only entryway in and out of Gaza right now, has been only open 5 days this entire year, and has been closed continuously since, I think, last September or so. So when we're talking about, opinions on Obama's, reassessment or reevaluation of U.S. policy and so forth, or whether they think there's any hope in, following the elections, or what they think about Netanyahu's election and so forth, it just doesn't register at all. It's such a hypothetical issue, such an abstract issue for most of them. I sort of say it's like asking someone who's drowning in a county pool what their thoughts are on the state taxes or approving a new building permit. It's like, I'm drowning here. So everyone is really just right now distracted with the daily business of survival. And these larger political issues certainly exist, but they form a backdrop to all of that. And unless it affects the household economies directly, then it just doesn't register. Josh mentioned the Defense for Children International report that just came out about the deliberate targeting of, I think it was 540 children last summer. And yet we're still hearing about how this was intended to, demolish the tunnels or deter the rocket attacks and so forth. I also just recently saw that something like 400,000 children are still shell-shocked after last summer. So, in the end of the day, we're talking about these household economies. We're talking about men and women without access to markets, right? And access is really the key word here. Farmers without access to land. fishermen without access to water because of the continued naval blockade. And this is all important because Palestinians in Gaza really thought things would change in some small way. At least their lives would improve somewhat after last summer's assault, which was the third assault, by the way, in 5 years. I mean, just to put things in perspective. I think it's something like the 12th since 1948 on that particular population. And things didn't get better at all. I mean, and again, we're better between quotations here. We're not talking about like an end to the occupation or anything. We're just talking about the border being open, or the fishing zones being expanded, or the farming areas along the buffer zone, again, would no longer be besieged. But that hasn't been the case. And to compound matters, something like 30,000 government employees in Gaza haven't been getting their salaries. And it's a long, sort of complicated chain related to the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah not getting the tax revenues from Israel because of their decision, or the PA's decision to join the ICC, and so on and so forth. And then you have, of course, some internal squabbling element between Hamas and Fatah. But in the end of the day, they haven't gotten their salaries, so they're the ones that are paying. And those 30,000 support something like a quarter of Gaza's population. So in addition to having something like 80% of the population now food insecure, reliant on food aid in order to feed their families, a situation the UN calls man-made. You know, we shouldn't be under any illusions that this is something that just happened, by accident or poor planning or politics. It was a deliberate situation that we all are funding. So in addition to that, these employees aren't getting their salaries. And one Palestinian on Twitter was sort of joking that in Gaza the problem is one of a lack of salaries, whereas in Ramallah it's quite the opposite. It's that the government employees are bound by their salaries, or some, we often hear about or get asked why aren't Palestinians sort of speaking up more in the West Bank, and a lot of them who are government employees are subject or bound or enslaved by those salaries they're getting. And so she was saying it was economic slavery at its worst, enslaving some people, starving others. And that, we've been talking a lot about Oslo and how it's dead, and, it's ironic because senior Palestinian officials have said repeatedly, including last year, that the Oslo Accords are moribund or dead, and yet they derive their legitimacy from it, so it's never really quite dead, if it makes sense. So Gaza's still, after last summer's assault, under a chokehold, talking about the imports and exports. Dual-use items are still forbidden from entering. And this includes, it sounds so, sort of daunting or scary, like dual use. But they include things like water disinfectant materials, so that 90% of Gaza's water is not drinkable anymore. Components for factories. I was looking up the very specific items this morning. Cement, drills, all these kinds of things that would enable the population to rebuild after last summer's assault, and enable NGOs as well, such as NearTerm, from building things like, cancer clinics. The head of NearTerm was telling us they had an entire project to build a new cancer clinic in southern Gaza because of the increasing rates of cancer, and they weren't able to because the materials required to build it weren't allowed in. The water treatment plant in central Gaza has been inoperable for years now because those materials, the water disinfectants, aren't allowed in. Farmers, are having sort of rethink strategies of how they plant because fertilizers aren't allowed in. And these are all, very basic things. And so what do? You have to sort of rethink an entire shift in the way you're planning, whether you're, on a governmental scale or as an individual, as a household. But, in the end, all of this is not really about, in the words of Israel, stopping terror. And it's all making Israel less secure, not more secure. Because in 2010, and I apologize if I'm digressing a bit, but Israeli officials, senior officials, very clearly stated this continued, U.S.-supported blockade is about preventing the development and the prosperity of the Palestinian people, as well as continuing the fragmentation. This is from senior IDF officials, continuing the fragmentation of the Palestinian people from one another in Palestine, the West Bank, and Jerusalem, and restricting their movement. That was actually in a presentation that these senior IDF officials were giving. So if that's the case, it's actually it's quite disturbing then that this administration is supporting a blockade that very specifically intends to forestall not only the political prospect but the development and the prosperity of the people. So in other words, very specifically targeting the productive sector, the farming, the industry, the fishing, the education sector, and so forth. And again, the way that's done is by restricting access to certain goods to be allowed in, as well as restricting the access of movement of people in and out of Gaza, such as students. Moving on, and again, the problem is you're leaving a population in Gaza of almost 2 million people, half of those students, 2/3 of them under the age of 25, sort of festering until what? Until the next time that Israel decides to mow the lawn in Gaza. And that's something that, after what happened last year, just shouldn't happen. We shouldn't have to reach that scenario. But again, speaking to friends and family, they're saying it's never, it's incomprehensible. It's hard to imagine how things could have gotten worse, is the way they put it. But they have. And people are really angry right now. They're just angry at whoever, those who aren't getting their salaries, those who, whether it's Egypt or Israel or the U.S. It's just a population that's literally stewing at any moment is going to explode. And who knows what that means. Going on to the Palestinian Authority, I talked about them deriving the legitimacy from the very accord that they claim, and we all want to believe is dead, but at the end of the day, how do you then change that paradigm or reframe it? So there seems to be also a lack of clarity within the Palestinian leadership itself. As concerns like global solidarity movements and Palestinians on the ground, very few of them, most of the population, as I mentioned, are in survival mode. Very few are actually aware of, they might be aware, but not in a way that they're connecting or networking with these movements. Except, I should add the caveat, the young, that population that is about, young and English-speaking, a lot of these English literature students, especially networking with those abroad, are very now beginning to actively support initiatives like Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, and so forth. And in terms of, a two-state, one-state solution, again, I think by now it's very clear to most Palestinians that a two-state solution or a separate independent Palestinian state is not feasible. But again, it's just not on their radar right now. That's not what people are discussing. They're just discussing, how can I get my next meal? 80% of the people are trying to find their next meal. That's what they're discussing. And again, that shouldn't be the case right now. In terms of, I know I don't have much time, so just ending with a few sort of what-to-dos or how, very practical steps, if there can be any. The aid to Gaza, whatever it was, $7 billion in aid that was pledged, has not yet made it to Gaza. And this is a serious problem. There's all these sort of bureaucratic hurdles and red tape. And somebody was telling me this morning it takes like, you have to go through 4 or 5 different agencies and, get it on the course of 5 months. And like, it's so complicated. So that aid needs to get, to where it was pledged. But, more importantly, and Josh talked about this, so I won't dwell on it too much, there needs to be a mechanism in place to ensure this doesn't happen again. I mean, I can't emphasize that enough. At the very least, if you don't want to, work towards ending the settlements, or you don't want to, change U.S. policy at its core, at the very least, put some mechanism in place. Hold Israel accountable so that, an assault like last summer or the one before that doesn't happen again. And a message needs to be sent, a very clear message to the Palestinian people that their lives and their rights matter too. Josh talked about the Leahy law. I was going to touch on that. But, a good example of what military unit that can be applied to is the Golani Brigade that was responsible for the massacre in the Shijaiya neighborhood in Gaza that you, I'm sure, all read about. In terms of weapons, I had read a statistic the other day that something like there was 2 bullets fired for every man, woman, and child in Gaza, which is astounding. Almost 4 million bullets. 40,000 mortars were fired into Gaza just during those 55 days. So it needs to be emphasized, I think, that Palestinians also need security. It's not just about addressing their basic humanitarian needs, which is very important, obviously. But we also need to sort of reframe that paradigm, because we always hear about it by State Department officials in the sense of, Israel needs a security, Palestinians need their economic, whatever it is, need economic incentives or something like that. But it's like the issue of freedom and security for Palestinians is never discussed. And then, speaking of humanitarian concerns, those do need to be addressed. And the reason that's important is, again, so the population can then move beyond the food insecurity and towards self-sufficiency. Issues like fishing, farming, eliminating this aid dependency. I remember the director of the UN field operation in Gaza a couple years ago told me that, the common refrain in Gaza is the hand that feeds us is the hand that strangles us. Because you'll frequently see the spent U.S. Missiles made in Pennsylvania or whatever, U.S.-made missiles rather, and then, or whatever it is, Caterpillar bulldozers raising an entire farmland, and then you'll see a sign propped up a couple months later said, reconstruction of this farm paid for by the U.S. people, by the American people. So clearly, that the message that's sending to the people there is not a good one. And finally, ensuring access, very significantly, access and movement for both people and goods. I've been talking a lot about goods, but I remember in 2006, after the disengagement, when Condoleezza Rice was negotiating the Access and Movement Agreement, she recognized at the time that this was a critical issue, that Palestinians need to have their freedom of movement. We've never moved beyond that or towards achieving that goal. And analysts and Palestinian economists at the time warned. They said unless following the disengagement, access and movement isn't guaranteed for people and goods, there's going to be a catastrophe, and that's exactly what happened. And in terms of people, what I'm talking about is, for example, the young, that make up 2/3 of Gaza are categorically banned from moving in or out, specifically to study. So you have a lot of these Palestinians who are getting U.S.-approved scholarships or in exchange programs and so forth. One of them whom I'm in contact with, Ruebner and Laila El-Haddad, received such a scholarship, and then she was denied exit. She wasn't allowed out. She had the U.S. visa, and of course, in order to obtain the U.S. visa, you have to obtain an Israeli permit because there's no embassy in Gaza. But that's again something very simple, ensuring the ability of students to move freely and access their higher educations, be it in Birzeit, in Israel, in Jerusalem, in the United States, in Egypt, and so forth. So I think I'll end there because we don't have much time, and maybe we'll go to question and answer. Thank you.
Pushing back on the general pessimism of the speakers, I'd like them to comment on a couple of observations and also on a recent Obama appointment for Middle East policy. It seems to me that Washington, if it's not becoming irrelevant, and it's not becoming irrelevant, it certainly is becoming less relevant. And the Palestinians are using some very strong principles and actions by resorting to international law and also to nonviolent methods of operation, including on the ground and the BDS movement. And in addition, the Israelis are actually, the Israeli leaders, helping in this effort. Israel is becoming more and more isolated, and one sign is what's happening in Europe, another is what's happening among Americans, including among the American Jewish community, and a third is the administration actually having to talk about a review of its policy and an evolution likely at or possible at the UN. And the second part is on, please comment on the recent appointment of Rob Malley to the National Security Council.
Go ahead, unless I have another question.
Hi, Phil Schrafer. First question to Joshua and William. Isn't there a relatively positive development in the fact that the Arab parties, I think maybe there's 4 parties, have actually worked together? Couldn't they become sort of like a seed drag or anchor to slow down settlements or to put more pressure on working with Gaza? And then the question for Laila is, isn't part of the problem that Hamas and al-Fatah aren't working together very effectively?
Well, just very briefly, I think you're right that the United States plays less and less of a central part in thinking about how this conflict might be addressed in the future. Partly because we've tried so many times and failed, and I think you're also right that the Palestinians have found ways of keeping the issue alive by going to international fora, ICC, BDS movement, and so forth. So the issue is not going to die from neglect or inattention. The Europeans in particular seem quite sensitive to it. But in terms of that translating into something that will bring about change on the ground in the near term. That's where I'm more skeptical. I think these are long-term trends that have to be assessed. You mentioned something that might, some of you may know or may not know, that the name Rob Malley. He has been on the National Security Council for some time, and of course he was also on in the Clinton period, but he's now the head of the Middle East, North Africa section, but he's primarily engaged with the Iran negotiations. His views on Arab-Israeli issues are quite good if he were the one who could make policy. And so I think it's not the problem that Obama isn't in touch with people who are reasonably sensible, who would recognize the validity of many of the things that have been said here today. It's that time has run out on Obama on this issue. He's just not going to get around to it in the time he has left. Iran's going to take his time. The battle against ISIS is going to take his time. And it should be possible to do more than one thing as president. But in this political climate, I think he's going to find that his hands are tied. And we have a presidential election year coming up. And if you think Obama's positions on the Middle East are a little bit shaky and soft and not up to what's needed, look at every single candidate who is declared, 19 Republicans and 1 or 2 Democrats. They're either awful, terrible, disastrous, or pretty darn bad, and nothing else. And at least with Obama, you could say the guy on some level understands issues. He hasn't been able to act on them. But I think the political landscape for this country in the coming few years, if the candidates we now have on offer are the ones, one of whom will become the new president, nothing that we have said here today gets better under their custodianship, which may mean that people who still care about this issue have to start thinking more about what can Europe do, what can the United Nations do, and other institutions, because we've blown it.
Sure. In terms of your question about yeah, I mean, you know, Palestinians obviously are, like I was saying, they're frustrated from several angles, and that's one of them, but it's not, they all recognize, I think, if you ask anyone on the street, that's not the source of the problem or the underlying, you know, it's not, and you know, also very importantly, Hamas and Fatah only make up part of the political spectrum. But you know, Hamas and Fatah aren't closing the borders. They're not, you know, blockading the sea or restricting farmers or preventing students from learning. Or it's frustrating, you know, on some level because it adds more red tape, and definitely they feel like entrapped and, you know, on a road to nowhere, and there's nothing they can do about it. And so a lot of them have chosen to sort of, like I was saying, focus on their own household economy and do what they can on whatever small level, and leave that bickering to be. But they certainly feel like there's no way for them to exercise or foster any sort of change. If that makes sense.
I apologize for if I left you with the impression that I'm pessimistic. I'm actually incredibly optimistic about where things are heading, because I think quite clearly we've broken through a very stale
Yeah, I was going to mention that, but
yeah, and you know, sometimes it's often darkest before the dawn, and not to try to sound crass about it, but this is the reality of social change in many circumstances. Let's not pretend that the transition to democracy and equality from apartheid in South Africa was accomplished all peacefully. In fact, the bloodiest repression occurred in the years leading up to that transition, as the apartheid regime desperately sought to retain its power. So I think Israel is trapped in a box of its own creation. The more desperate it becomes, the more violent it will act toward the Palestinians, and the more support it will lose internationally. And I don't think this is tenable in anything but the short term. I really think that something is going to open up very dramatically very soon, historically speaking. And it's often the case that social change, when it does occur, is often completely unpredictable. In terms of Arab state supports to the Palestinian people, I don't see any real evidence of any tangible support. In fact, I see the opposite. I see-
Arab parties.
I think he was
Oh,
talking about
the
Arab parties in
the
in
joint,
Israel.
yeah.
Okay.
Joint
Apologies.
list, yeah.
Apologies for misunderstanding. Yep, I think that's an extremely positive development. The fact that the Palestinian political parties within Israel unified ranks along with Hadash, which is the joint Palestinian Jewish Communist Party, to run on a joint electoral list. The Palestinian parties are now the third largest contingent in the Israeli parliament and have announced themselves as a significant factor in Israeli politics. And I think that when the time comes for actual, real negotiations to resolve this issue, I think that Palestinian citizens of Israel will play a huge, huge role in terms of bridging these gaps and serving as a party that has a place in both societies and can bridge those gaps.
I'm Layla's father. I left Gaza on June 8 last year, and since then all the borders have been closed. This is just a comment more than a question regarding Hamas and Fatah. Actually, both parties wanted to unite, and when the unity government was formed last year, the first thing that happened was Israel threatened Mahmoud Abbas that if this goes on, all the aid, all the tax money will not be paid to the government. So Israel is opposing this. It's true that the Palestinians want to unite because this is their probably only hope to the outside world, but Israel is opposing this, and they just don't have much to do about it. Thank you.
I should add, there was a Palestinian unity government that was formed. It's still sort of not operational as a unity government in the full sense of the word, but 13 of members of that unity government are in Gaza now, trying to sort of negotiate the salary payments to the employees.
Yeah, the problem is that the U.S. public has no idea of what's going on. And unless you change public perception in the United States, nothing's really going to change. And the question is, how can we get speakers like you a wider audience?
Okay, I'm Nasser Khilji. I'm with the U.S. Treasury, but I don't represent the Treasury here. I'm here in a personal capacity. Thank you very much for your realistic assessment, Professor Quandt, and I was really impressed by you, Josh. I think you were optimistic in a weird kind of way, but and Laila, facts on the ground. I'm looking at it, and Professor Quandt, you've got a big historical background to this whole thing. When you look at the lobby that you mentioned, the Jewish lobby, and how it has moved over the past 40, 50 years, starting from the memo that you outlined, Josh, and where the Israeli lobby has evolved, do you really think at all, looking in the future, we're talking about 15 candidates on the Republican side and one candidate, let's think about the Clinton. Let's be a little positive. Since you were talking about the 1990s was a window, do you think that Hillary Clinton, so there are two questions here. Number one, in terms of a realistic US involvement in the future ever, I think Obama was probably the last best hope. Going forward, do you really think that Clinton may offer some reassessment? So that's one question. The other is, as someone here mentioned, that is it time that it's all over, really, for the US, unless there is a political and an electoral movement within this country to move to the other side? Thank you.
Well, I'll answer the Hillary question briefly. I don't think there's much chance. she was Secretary of State for 4 years, did all she could to avoid getting involved with this issue. And she was senator from New York. She's the least bad of the candidates. I think I can say that from what they have publicly been saying, but that's not saying very much. I don't think we should have very high hopes. I'll leave it at that.
Any other comments on the panel?
Hillary Clinton is the biggest flip-flopper around. She was the first U.S. politician when she was First Lady to declare her support for Palestinian statehood back in 97 or 98, I believe it was. And at that time, it was such a hostile climate to that notion of establishing a Palestinian state that there was a bipartisan letter from Congress to President Clinton condemning the First Lady for these remarks. And of course, President Clinton came out and said, my wife's comments only represent her own personal opinions. They, of course, don't represent my administration, et cetera, et cetera. And she was very proud as Secretary of State of being the first U.S. politician to come out in support of Palestinian statehood. But she's a huge flip-flopper. I mean, look, she came out very strongly opposing Israel's colonization of Palestinian land as Secretary of State. And now she's out selling her book and running for president and says, well, maybe I was too harsh on Israel in telling them to stop their settlement activities. So bottom line, I think Hillary Clinton will do and say whatever it takes to attract the support and, more importantly, the financial means to run for president. But what she would actually do as president, I don't know. She might surprise people.
Assuming that she's Oh no, I mean, you both covered the points well. In terms of your concern about, having this narrative out there more often, that's why I'm so cynical about, and why I sort of switched to trying to, narrate the Palestinian story and amplify Palestinian voices. And a lot of my work focuses on conveying the realities that Palestinians face, for this specific reason, because I feel like that's the most effective way to be able to reach the American public. Whether it's through what I've recently done through my the cookbook, The Gaza Kitchen, or other trying to work with and mentoring young Palestinian writers in Gaza to amplify their voices and be able to bring them here on scholarships to the U.S. and so forth.
Can I add in
Yeah,
on the
please.
public perception
Yeah.
issue quickly? I forgot. I think we've seen tremendous
Yeah.
shifts
Yeah, absolutely.
in public perception and public opinion.
I think that's probably where we're the most optimistic, I would say.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look at what Israel's base of support in the United States is today. According to public opinion polls, that base of support tends to be whiter, older, more Republican, and more wealthy
And
than
evangelical.
other segments, and evangelical, than other segments of the country. Whereas amongst people of color, youth, women, Democrats, working class, there's a tremendous amount of sympathy for the Palestinian people. And in some of these constituencies, even majority support for Palestinians. So things are dramatically changing at the grassroots level. And what we're seeing this translate into policy differences as well between the parties, because we're seeing Israel becoming more and more of a Republican issue in Congress. And I think this is going to eventually embolden the Democratic Party to be a bit more responsive to where their base is. And I would say also, in the past 5 years, there's really been unprecedented access to the mainstream media for Palestinians, for Palestinian Americans, for people who support Palestinian rights. The coverage, the on-the-ground coverage of the New York Times and the Washington Post is still terrible in many respects. But the opinion pages, the ability to get on television, that's changing dramatically in a positive way.
Actually, that's what I kind of wanted to ask you about as well, is the groups in the U.S. that are defying the Israel lobby, that are standing up to it, especially Jewish Voice for Peace, or and also all the groups that are embracing the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, including the major churches like the Presbyterians and the Methodists. So you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, go.
This is Josh's
Yeah, exactly. It's your-
portfolio.
Well, we've seen really tremendous growth in the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement in the U.S., especially on college campuses. There have now been more than 24 student governments on college campuses that have passed divestment resolutions, and actually one university that is actually divesting money from corporations that support Israel's oppression. And we've seen major mainstream church denominations also pass not only boycott resolutions, boycotting Israeli settlement goods, but also divestment resolutions from corporations like G4S, Motorola, Caterpillar, Hewlett-Packard, all of which profit from Israel's oppression of the Palestinian people, and calling for an end to U.S. military aid to Israel. So these are very, very substantial shifts, and I think if we look at the history of social change in this country, it's always the result of politicians catching up to changes in civil society. So I'm not concerned that the politicians haven't gotten it yet, because they're always the last ones to get it.
Pope Francis
Okay.
also.
Pope Francis. All right, well, before I conclude this session, is there anything any of the panelists want to add?
I just add one point, and unfortunately it's on the not so hopeful side. I hate to be the voice of gloom here, but we haven't talked about the role of money in American politics, which offsets the positive trends in public opinion in a fairly dramatic way. It's hard to overstate the impact of people like Sheldon Adelson and the Koch brothers in terms of funneling money to candidates and saying, and this is where we expect you to stand on these issues. It's just appalling the amount of money that goes without any regulation. I think I read today that the Koch brothers are planning to put $1 billion almost into the presidential election, and they've already chosen their candidate. They know who they want.
Can you tell us who that is?
Yeah, Scott Walker, for some reason, they just think he's cool. Guess what his position is on Israeli-Palestinian issues. So who knows whether, you can't just buy an election, but money, unfortunately, plays a bigger role in American political elections than it has ever done before. So yes, public opinion may be evolving in important directions, but you know, if we could change one thing about American politics that would make it easier for those voices to actually be heard, is to get the huge corporate money out of its corrupting role in American politics.